All right, everyone. Welcome to episode 3 of Tesh on Tap. I'm speaking with Farhan Thawar today, VP Engineering at Shopify. And I'll let him introduce himself, and then we can talk a little bit about what we're drinking or not drinking today.
Cool. Hey, Meetesh. So Meetesh and I worked together, I guess, 20 years ago, something like that. I think when you were an intern, when I lived in Austin working at Trilogy. And I guess in my career, I've worked at small companies and large companies, like small, worked at started my own company, and very large, like Microsoft size. And over the last 10 years or so, I got into mobile. And most recently, my company got acquired by Shopify 2 years ago. And so I'm VP Engineering at Shopify right now.
Awesome. Well, I'm drinking this time around a local Austin beer called Electric Jellyfish from Pint House Brewing, Pint House Pizza here. Probably one of the most popular IPAs in town here. And Farhan, you decided you're going to actually go the sweets route this time.
Yeah, so I'm just drinking water because I mostly gave up alcohol. Maybe I'm just too old. And instead, I actually eat a lot of sugar. So my favorite snack now is this thing called Celebration. They're like two cookies in one.
Mm-hmm.
So it's basically just a 2-pack of cookies, and it's exactly the right amount, so you don't end up eating like a whole box of cookies. And That's so awesome. I grab those every once in a while. Yeah, it's called Celebration, and it's got cookie on one side and chocolate on the other side.
Like the little French cookies with like a shortbread cookie with like chocolate on top.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, it doesn't have shortbread; it's just a regular cookie, but it has chocolate. So,
awesome.
Yummy.
Good deal. All right, so a little backstory. In episode 1, I was talking to Dwayne, and we talked a little bit about diversity and building diverse pipelines, and recruiting and interviewing came up there. And I referenced, I'll get to it, but I referenced an article that I think you wrote in 2017. And then speaking with DR last time, who the three of us worked together at Trilogy back in the day, we also talked about interviewing, and basically what came up was like, what is the state of and the value of technical interviews right now? And that, there was a recent, I think it was an HBR post that talked about how technical interviews don't measure capability, they measure ability to deal with anxiety, right? Which is a very different thing. And that got me back to thinking about your post and your kind of view that, hey, technical interviews are garbage. Why do that? The TLDR is, instead of that, do a 90-day paid job and then evaluate them on the position. And so I guess maybe we'll start with just like, what can you summarize, I guess, that high level view that you had?
Yeah, so this all started in thinking of like, what's the best way to evaluate whether someone's a fit for your company, right? And the state of the art is like, let's do interviews. And if you go to anybody and you said, hey, if you had the opportunity to choose between 2 sets of data, interview data or real work data, what would you choose? And the answer is real work data, right? Like, and you don't even have to use like technology. You think about race car driving. If you could have interview data of a race car driver or actual lap timing and video footage of a race car driver, what would you take to decide who you should be on your race car team? Well, it's probably put them in the car, right? Like it's that data. And so what I tried to do was distill down a process which we could use to evaluate people that used the closest data to the real job as possible. And in order to do that experiment, what I did was I made sure we had a very rigorous 90-day onboarding process. Like we had 30, 60, 90-day check-ins. And I would just shrink the interview time over a period of weeks. So we had like a 2 or 3 hour interview, like with 3 different people, different technical, like whiteboard coding back then, but also coding on a laptop, technical deep dive, architecture. And I kept shortening it by 15 minutes. So it'd be like 3 hours, and it's 2:45 and 2:30, 2:20, 2:15, like all the way down. And we got it down to 15 minutes. And what we realized was the people coming in, the signal wasn't changing. Like the thing we thought in 15 minutes was true was still true, was the same signal we were getting from a 3 hour interview. And what we did was we shifted that time. So we still spent 3 hours, but we used that time in onboarding instead to make sure they were a fit in the company. And by that, I mean, we really spent time with them and set expectations that, hey, in the first 90 days, we're going to both evaluate. You evaluate us as the company. We're going to evaluate you as the employee. And let's use that data as a way to see if you're a fit for the company. And what we learned were 2 really important things. One was, even when people didn't make it through the 90 days, they were grateful for having like a 90-day shot instead of like a 2 hour, 3 hour interview shot, because you're right, anxiety is what you're testing there. And instead they got to program, in our case, pair program, for a period of time with different people on different teams and really had a real shot at coming in. And the second thing we learned was that we were removing bias from our interview process because we were just removing the interview, right? So if you think about interviews as a bias introduction machine, like how does somebody look? How tall are they? What race are they? Gender? Did they go to the same, like, is this someone I want to have beer with, which is like a culture question? All that goes away when you don't interview. And instead you just look at the work. And so we ended up with all kinds of people who didn't have degrees, who did, older, younger, men, women, different races, because we didn't care. Right? Actually, the person who took over for me when I left was a NHL drafted hockey player who finished high school. Like, who thought that he would be the director of engineering after me? Like, you wouldn't look at it from his resume. So it was a great test of that theory. And so I talk about all the time saying, hey, can you just get a better gauge of interview instead of interviews? Can you have a better gauge of performance? And that's how we did it there.
And so that's awesome, by the way. I mean, I love it because when you look at it and think about it, for pretty much at all sorts, every other position, right? When you look at artists, you look at, construction, they're all talking about their portfolios, about real work, right? You look at designers, they're talking about real work. And, this is one of the few positions where you're not talking about real work. You're talking about trying to put them through artificial work that may or may not pan out. How did you, in those 15 minutes, how did you avoid the whole notion of like hiring people like you, right? Because one of the things that happens in the first few minutes is you get a feel for, will I get along with this person? Does this person like me, right? So how do you overcome that bias in just the first 15 minutes?
Yeah, so the 15-minute interview was very tactical. Mm-hmm. It was like a coding problem. And what I did instead was, and I remember talking to Facebook about this because they had very deep technical interviews over many hours. And I was like, oh, I think we can do better by just doing like a 15-minute like high school coding problem. Like all I was looking for in the 15 minutes was, does this person write code often, right? Not about the complexity of code, and in a 15-minute high school question, you can basically tell like if it's do they write a lot of code or not? And so I'm really trying to even remove any kind of conversation in many ways because I don't want to know anything about the person. In some ways, actually, I don't even want to see their resume. Like, I don't want to be biased by the school they went to. I don't want to be like this happened actually to me when I started at Extreme Labs. Was everybody I hired, I just look back, I'm like, everybody's from Waterloo.
Yep.
And it was because I went to Waterloo and I was probably unconsciously looking at those resumes and not the other ones.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened to me. And so after a while, I'm like, I just want to see their name. I don't want to see anything about their resume. And then I would look at the work they were producing, and that drove amazing things. Like one of our top iOS engineers was a history major. Like, again, you never would have known.
Yep. Yeah, that's interesting. And I wonder, like, did you also see this for people like I'm guessing you probably had to do something different if you were going after like someone who already had a job versus people who were just applying, who were in the market? Or were you able to apply it in a similar way?
No, so it's funny because this is the thing that comes up the most often where somebody will say to me, oh, but if someone's like comfortable in their job, they won't leave for like a 90-day job trial. Mm-hmm. And my retort to that is every new job is a 90-day job trial. Like, mm-hmm. It doesn't matter if you here's a good example. If you go to Google and you interview and you crush your 8 hours of interviews and you get a job there, but then you suck for the first 90 days. Should Google keep you or not? Like, should they just look at your interview performance? No, they should let you go. So my retort to them is every job is a 90-day interview. And all I was doing was being extremely explicit, right? I don't think I was exiting people more quickly in the first year. Yes, I was exiting in the first 90 days. But isn't it better to exit someone in the first 90 days if they're not a fit and they don't think you're a fit for the company? Like, aren't you giving them that opportunity to then for the next 9 months not be in your company, like sucking or not realizing you're not a fit and you're missing out on whatever the next opportunity is? So I was just very clear with people. In actual conversations, it never was a blocker from people switching jobs. But whenever I talk about this approach, it's always the first thing that people bring up. They're like, no one's going to want to move to Toronto with their family. And it never was a blocker for us.
Well, that's really interesting because you think about it, and it is because all of a sudden, in some ways you can look at it, the pressure's off, right? Instead of 1 3-hour block, I have 90 days to do what I know I can do.
Right. And guess what? Some people didn't really turn it on until 60 days. Like there were some people who really took a long time to get going, and I'm glad we had 90 days because they were so amazing. I have a great example of, there was this woman who was new to iOS engineering, took her a long time to get going, 6 weeks, 7 weeks. We're like, we don't think she's gonna make it. After she finished her 90 days, she was the first person I tried to hire when I started my new company. Like that's how amazing she was. And it takes time for people. Like you have to learn a new language. It was a new company. We had pair programming, but it's so amazing that like all kinds of people have a full 3 months to figure it out.
But there was a time a few years ago when I pulled my team, and 50% of our team was non-STEM, right? Like non-traditionally educated. And one was a woman we hired who previously was a barista, and went through a coding boot camp and came in with so much potential, and she's exceeded even the potential that we thought she had, right? She's been phenomenal. And it's just been awesome to sit back and watch that growth. And you look at it and you're like, no amount of traditional like interview would have captured that. Yet she's been a phenomenal part of the team and a huge impact to the team.
Right. And what's funny, so here again, I'll say a few funny things. We had many acquisition offers over the many years. And in 2011, both Google and Facebook tried to buy Extreme Labs. And when in picking the engineers to go interview, because they're like, hey, pick 5 engineers and we want to interview them. I couldn't pick these non-traditional folks. I had to find people who had the software engineering degree because that's how Google interviews. Even though my top engineers might not fit into that. Well, it was super strange, but I'm like, here are the people I have to choose because that's going to fit the mold. I mean, it's funny, but that's the traditional model.
Yep. No, I get it. And that's one of the reasons why we've never made, a college degree a requirement, right? Like that, it's a nice to have on there, but like that's never been it. In some positions, we want more computer science experience. Some positions we don't. That's awesome. So have you, are there any instances where you can say like, you pointed out one where it worked really well, right? Where there was someone who, after 60 days turned it on and then it was going to be your first hire. Is there like an instance where it didn't pan out or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, it turns out that if you do a deep dive that into real work, you're basically going to figure this out in 90 days instead of a year. Like that's my heuristic argument was that you'll just figure out in 90 days what would have taken you a year, because you like think about the sunk cost, right? If you put in 3 to 5 hours in interviews, you're not going to let somebody go in 3 months because you're like, all the time we spent and look at all the, look at our hiring funnel and it, takes us like 40 hours in aggregate to hire a person. But for us, we only had 15 minutes of data. So we were looking at, we didn't have a sunk cost. And when they come in, of course, you're training somebody up, you're pair programming, but we exited, I would say 10 to 15% of the people in like the first 3 months. But our attrition rate after 3 months was extremely low because people knew they were a fit and they wanted to be in that high learning environment. So it was a little bit of a trade-off. So it's more about, yes, we had much more attrition in the first 90 days, but it became also part of our culture. Like when it was identified that somebody wasn't a fit, either from their side or our side, and they left, the attitude of the company would be raised because we're like, okay, the people who are fit are still here and the people who are not here. And that's good for everybody.
And making it explicit probably helped with that, right? Which is everyone knew this is not a surprise. It was nothing, like it was upfront and out in the open with everyone.
Right. And so actually you're hitting on a very important point. When I would sit down with people and say, hey, look, it's not working out, they would say, I'm not happy, but I'm not surprised. They knew they were getting feedback the whole time. It was explicit from the beginning of how the company works. And so when they rolled out, everybody knew it was a good thing for them and us. And here's the best part. Many times they would say, I'm going to refer my friends. Like they're like, it was a great experience to go through. They learn something and then they go on and hopefully find something that's a better fit for them.
That's awesome. And so have you been able to carry that through to now, like to other places? I mean, obviously you were one of the founders at help.com, right?
Yeah. So at Extreme Labs, I was early, but I wasn't the founder, but that's where, we came up with this approach. At Helpful, we did the exact same approach where, here's another funny example. I went to a coffee shop and I met a data science engineer. Didn't really look at the resume because I don't. And I just went for a 15-minute walk and we just talked because I don't know anything about data science, let alone even give them a problem. we hired him. And after the first year at the Christmas party, he goes, just so you know, I don't know if you guys know, but this is my first software job. Like, it was amazing. And he was amazing. He's at Shopify now. He came with us as part of the acquisition. So it's just amazing. We were like, what? He was a hardware engineer who was interested in data science. And what's funny is, at the same time, we had hired a PhD in machine learning who teaches at the university, and he was not a fit. So resume to resume, you'd pick person A over B, but for what we needed in our company, person B was the right person.
Awesome.
And then how far has it taken? So at Shopify, we have a different approach, not dissimilar in like what it's trying to do. So one thing we do is we have a part of our interview process called the life story, where we try to dig into, it's nothing to do with technology. It's a view into like, how do we find the most curious, interesting people we can find as like our first screening part of our process. We also don't care about your, like, if you've gone to university. I mean, our CEO, right, got into the workforce at 16. So it's a normal thing for us to think through. And we're constantly trying to figure out what are the right signals in order for us to figure out, can we find a better proxy for performance than these interviews. So we do still have an interview process. It's not that a whiteboard process. It is a pair programming and a technical deep dive, but it's much more tailored from a life story perspective to bring in as many diverse voices into the company to match the set of million plus merchants that are just as diverse as the employees we have.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm speaking with Farhan Thawar, VP Engineering at Shopify, not Spotify.
Correct.
About that little inside joke later. And one of the things we were talking about earlier is pairing and pair programming, to be explicit. And so, if we rewind back, both of us kind of entered the software industry at a time where 6 to 12 month release cycles were kind of the norm. And I remember being very inspired by a book by Kent Beck called Extreme Programming. And I think that, if people that kind of grew up with lowercase a agile today, right, like they would look at that and kind of look and say, duh, that's obvious, right? Like all those things are kind of underlie what we do today. But 20 years ago, that wasn't obvious, right? Like his book was a change agent, right? Like he was trying to infect change. And, there was a couple things that I took from it, right? It was kind of the start of TDD, test-driven development, which I practiced for many years. And it's kind of imbued its way. There's also a big thing that I took to, early on at the Zebra and a lot of things I've done, which was this question of asking, is there an explicit requirement for this right now? And if not, you don't do it, right? You don't incur prospective future maintenance costs on something you don't know will happen, right? Now that changes over time, right? Because when you're 3 people in a warehouse, you need to know if something is going to be a requirement now. When you're 300 people, you know if something's going to be a requirement in 6 months, right? Like that, it changes over time. But the other thing that he talked about in that book was this notion of pair programming, right? And so I know that there's been tons of debate, like it's kind of died down over the years, and like there's been other variations which we'll get to. But I'm really curious because at Extreme Labs, right? I believe at Extreme, and then at Pivotal too, and then you mentioned one of the core tenets was that everybody pairs. Right. And so I guess tell me a little bit about how that came about, what worked, what didn't. Yeah.
So the founders of Extreme Labs, the way it started actually was Sunny, who was one of the co-founders, was doing a project with Pivotal Labs for a previous startup. And he got more excited about how they were building the software than the software he was building. And he was like, I need to figure out like what's going on here. And he realized that he wanted to start a company that used that similar approach. And so what Extreme Labs was like a Pivotal Labs style software shop, but focused on mobile. Because the other genius insight him and Umar had, and I went to school with Umar, was that mobile was going to be like a real form factor and a real dominating force. And they started in 2007, right after the iPhone came out, and amazing timing. And I joined in 2009. And what happened was I was just coming to hang out with Umar, and I was like, what's going on in this company? Like I saw 2 people on every computer. It was a high energy environment. Everyone was talking, but like code was getting written. They seemed to be learning at a very fast rate because they were talking so much and they were explaining things. And one person was staring at the screen, the other person was typing, and they're going back and forth. I was like, I've never seen this before. And so when I joined, I learned by pairing with an intern that it was the fastest way that I've ever learned anything. So he knew Ruby on Rails. I didn't, but I knew about building scalable architectures for systems. And we built a very sophisticated like hedge fund trading tool. And I was impressed by like, one, he was learning from me as we were building and I was learning from him. And I was like, this is insane. Mm-hmm. And what I realized over time was it's a way to have a high fidelity conversation, write lots of code, learn from each other, not have siloed information, because you can actually like switch pairs with another team. It allowed you to not get distracted, right, by other things that might be happening. And you could have what we call sustainable pace. If you worked from just 9 to 6 every day, right, like 8 hours a day within 1 hour lunch, but you were coding almost that whole time because you're pairing, it's almost like time travel. You would get way more done than most people. The other thing that was also the interesting introspection there was the bottleneck to writing good software is not hands to keyboard, right? Like one of the famous sayings about pair programming is they say, oh, if you have 2 people on one machine, won't they only write half as much code? Yep. And the answer is, oh, we hope they write even less than that.
Yep.
Because the idea is not about lines of code. It's about just the right amount of code, right? Like the code, I mean, we know code is a liability. You actually just want to write the minimum amount of thing. It tends to be more elegant when you have 2 people working together because they don't tend to hack, they tend to think things through, and they tend to both understand what's the things about code, which is it's going to be read more than it's written.
Yeah, and so that's an interesting point because if you look at one part of the entire delivery process, it's code reviews, right? Like peer code reviews, and there's a lot of reasons for that. There's quality checking. There's also like getting insight on what you did, but there's sharing knowledge and insights into the code so someone other than you knows about it. And so did you find that this actually just compacted those into one, where 2 people didn't just like, your code reviewer didn't just cursorily understand it, they like intimately understood it?
Yeah, so the way you think about it is, you talked about Kent Beck earlier. The way that a lot of the agile practices happened was that they took a good idea and they turned the volume to 11,
yep.
Right? So a good idea in software is to write tests that test your software. And then people were like, we should test at least 10% of our software. Then we're like 30%, 40%, 50%. And then somebody got to like, we were 100%. And somebody goes, what if you wrote the test first? Mm-hmm. Right? And that's what TDD is write the test first. And that's turning the volume up to 11. And pair programming is code reviews. It's like, we should do a code review every month, every week, every day. What if we just wrote it together? Yep, like exactly. That's literally and that's turning up code reviews to 11. So if you think code reviews are a good idea and they're a way to share knowledge, learn, mentor someone, break knowledge silos, then why not do it all the time?
That's what about the flip side of that, I guess, which is that what did the people who came from jobs or things where they weren't used to pairing, where they wanted their individuality, where they it can be intense, right? Like there's an aspect of when you're solving a problem together with someone, there's a lot of adrenaline. It's fun, it's awesome, it's exciting, but it's also intense and exhausting.
Yeah, and I think that's part of it, where we wanted to get away from like the solo, like we both worked at Trilogy. I was working 100 hours a week, writing lots and lots of code. And what's amazing about pair programming is you are definitely exhausted and depleted after an 8-hour session. Mm-hmm. And what's amazing about that is like you kind of left everything on the field. It's like going to the gym, right? Like you go to the gym for an hour, and then when you're not in the gym, your muscles are rebuilding. And what was happening here was you would go in for a very intense session for 8 hours. And then when you weren't there, your brain was recovering and new ideas were coming in. So when you came in the next day, you were fresh to then attack the problem again in a new way. And so for people who are not used to it, it takes like 2 or 3 weeks to get used to. Mm-hmm. But in many cases, people feel like they never learned as much as they did when they were in this pairing environment. And there was a good quote that I saw this week that I tweeted out that said something like, when one teaches, 2 learn.
I love that. Yep.
Yeah. And it's this idea that like even the teacher, the senior engineer, or the person like who's driving and teaching the like is learning, because what I found is that back and forth is a constant like push and pull. Like, think about this. If I wanted to learn a lot about the zebra, wouldn't the best way to just be sitting beside you 40 hours a week for like a month? Like, wouldn't we both learn a ton about each other and about like the environment we're in?
It's funny. I've always felt that if for me to teach something, like it just helped me learn it better. And a funny little like tangential side story is I when I was in like early high school, actually this might have been middle school. We're doing algebra and the graphing calculator came out. I had my TI 85 and then like all that stuff. And the first one, I think the TI-85 was the first programmable one, like truly programmable one. And I remember our Algebra 2 teacher at the time said, if we could write a program to solve what was going on, and we had to write it ourselves, hand in the code to make sure there's no plagiarism, we could use it on the test. Genius idea, because I, being interested in computers and that, would always write the program, and I never even had to use it because I knew it so well by having to understand it well enough to write it that like I didn't need to use it. I understood it for the test, and that was better than any kind of studying or memorization could be because I learned it well enough for that. And so that's kind of that point of like, if you know something well enough to teach it, then you're learning it better yourself.
That's exactly right. And I think that it's counterintuitive that a senior and a junior together would be able to both learn at that in that environment. But it turns out that as long as somebody has the fundamentals of like what you're trying to do, and they just ask you questions, like here's a funny story. We have this thing called like odd pairing. Like if you have 5 people, you can't pair, right? Because you only have 2 pairs. And we had this giant stuffed banana, and you would pair with the banana.
Really?
And what you're doing is you're just talking to the banana. It's like when you go to talk to somebody else and you're explaining the problem and you figure out the answer.
Yep.
Right? Like and so you would just pair with the banana. And yes, the banana is not the same as another smart engineer beside you, but by talking and doing it and like working together, you're just talking through what you're doing. And it turns out your thoughts become more logical.
You know, that's funny because that kind of leads me to something that I learned about a couple of years ago that's along the lines of pair programming that I will admit, like I don't know a ton about, but some, which is called mob programming.
Yep.
Right. And the general philosophy was like, can we take some of the aspects of pair that didn't work quite as well, which is like, what if one person on the pair like wasn't participating and was just kind of like out, right? Like some of the degenerate cases, or you have an odd number of people. And also look at I'm sure many of us have felt that feeling of like there's some urgent thing down in production and we're all huddled around one guy on a keyboard, or woman for that matter. And like there's that adrenaline, that feeling of like we can solve this together. Everyone's like, it's fun, it's exciting, and it's exhausting, but you get so much done. And so based on my understanding, like that there's this general philosophy of get everyone you need to solve a problem, whether that's engineers, QE, design, product, everyone together, and you all solve that one thing together. And then there's rules around rotating, you take 7-minute stints or something like that. And, like if you're on the keyboard, you can't participate, you're just translating, right? Only other people can, but then you rotate out and things like that. So have you experienced any of that at all? Have you looked into mob programming?
Yeah, so I've definitely looked into mob programming. We do it. I mean, you've explained it much more elegantly than other people who say like it's basically one person on keyboard and everybody yelling at them. But I like the analogy you gave, which is that this is what we say in pair programming. We say, why don't you code through my hands? Right? So I'll do it, but you're telling me what to do because then I'm learning how to do it. And actually, what you typically say in pair programming is you say, the person who is least experienced should be the driver. So the navigator is basically directing them to do things. And then the driver can say, oh, why do we do it this way? And what about that? And it's amazing to see everything all the way down to the keyboard shortcuts, which is hard in COVID times. But we use a remote pair programming tool called Tuple, which is very good for remote pair programming, but you don't get all the nuances as you do in person. But it's quite intense. I mean, somebody the other day asked me like, hey, one day when you retire, what do you want to do? And I said, I'm going to pay people to pair program with me, because I just want to keep learning.
That's it. So I guess the last little bit on pairing, which is if you had someone who wanted, let's say they want to get into it, they want to start doing it or start to introduce it, where would you recommend they go to learn about it?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different places. One, there's lots of stuff on like YouTube and like if you want to learn about pairing. I have a book on my shelf somewhere here called Pair Programming Illuminated. It's probably in one of these shelves, which is a great introduction as well. I think there are companies online that you can you can pay people to like pair with you to like help you fix your problems. Like that's another way. The other thing I would say is it's not just about programming. It can be pair designing. It can be pair like writing email. There's so many things you could just pair with. Actually, like you and I, know this person. I was working with somebody, a few years ago on something, and I said, hey, why don't we just both do the slide deck at the same time? And it was a Google Hangout. It was an hour long. We were talking and working on slides together, and I'm like, we're pairing on the slide deck. Like that's exactly what. So it doesn't have to be that. And I remember. when I was at Extreme Labs, I also ran the finance department. Every 2 weeks, we did pair invoicing. I would sit down, same computer, and we would generate invoices together. Like, it doesn't have to be just programming.
Yeah, and it probably eliminates some of the loneliness, and you kind of enjoy it more too.
Well, this is the thing I found. We always found mistakes. Always. She found mistakes in my thing.
The error is human, right? Like,
exactly. But it's funny because you think you're doing it to your, best ability. And then we would do it. And we're like, every time we're like, geez, I'm so glad we're doing this pairing.
Everyone, welcome back. Talking with Farhan Thawar, VP Engineering at Shopify. And now I want to get to actually something that introduced us in the first place, which was Trilogy Software. So, for those who don't know, Trilogy was an enterprise software company in Austin, Texas. Started in the early 90s, kind of had its heyday in the late 90s and early 2000s, to the point where, it even got to be, I believe it was on Steve Ballmer was the one who, famously said, that the only recruiting competition Microsoft had at the time was this small software company in Austin, Texas. And, I'm a case in point because coming out of college, the two offers that I came down to was Microsoft and Trilogy, and I ended up going to Trilogy. One of the things that I think Trilogy really nailed was college recruiting, right? They had a whole plan. They did everything from like going to go get the best people, then had a cycle of sending recent hires back to go talk to their peers that they knew. So I'd love to hear some of your take on like what Trilogy did right or wrong with college recruiting.
Yeah, I would say the number one, this is a very salient point for me now as Shopify tries to go from 2,000 to 4,000 engineers this year, talking about recruiting. But the thing that they really made possible was that it was the number one priority in your job. Like, you could basically be doing anything in the company, and if you said, "Oh, I have to take this interview, I have to meet this candidate, I have to do recruiting," everybody knew that took priority.
Yep.
And I think that was such a level setting for the whole company. And I don't know if this was your experience, but from my experience, I didn't work Fridays like on software. Yep. I spent every Friday for 3 years that I was at Trilogy interviewing, talking to candidates, going to lunches, meeting with them, taking them to dinner after. Like, that was every Friday all the time. There was never a thing, even if my manager liked it or didn't like it, that they could do, because it was a company level priority. So I think the thing they did right was they gave permission to let everybody know, hey, look, this is part of your job. And it's not only part of your job, it is the most important thing. You can stop the other thing you're doing, whatever it is, and focus on recruiting if recruiting is a priority. So that was the first thing that they did super well. And that is something that I've taken to my whole career. I've always prioritized recruiting.
I'm with you on that, which is that, at the end of the day, what is a company but the people, right? And, one of the main reasons I went to the Zebra was to be able to go build a team of people that I wanted to work with, that challenged me, that were, made me better, that I could make better. And so it all comes down to people, and you're not going to get the great people if you don't invest in getting them and growing them, right? And I think that actually also speaks to one of the things that Trilogy, what was unique, it was intense, but did really well, which was Trilogy University, or TU for short, which was, this was a time where, no hyperbole, we did work 100 hours a week. I think I literally went home for a few hours to sleep, but I ate all my meals there. I worked, we had beanbags, we had everything, but we didn't just come in and get this slow introduction to the company and, a little project. We were put right on to do this work, learn this, hardcore technical courses from the best technical people, business courses, and it was almost like an MBA in like 3 months.
Yeah, and I think that you're right. Trilogy University was also a place where there was such bonding going on that they ended up being like lifetime bonds. If you read, I think Google recently came out with an article called Google's Quest to Build the Perfect Team. And if you look at the things they figured out, they were all figured out by Trilogy 20 years ago. Yep. Right? It said have a personal bond with people, talk about your own life and experiences. And we had that SEE approach, which was like shared emotional experience. Yep. And there was something about the culture of intensity and smart people that really shaped us. Actually, there's a really good HBR article called Career Imprinting, which talks about how the first job you get out of school imprints you for the rest of your working career. And you can definitely tell when you meet Trilogy people that there's something different.
Just yesterday, you tweeted this this Venn diagram of things that I learned at other companies and things that I learned at Shopify, right? And so I'd love to kind of learn more about that. Like what has been so unique about Shopify compared to your previous work experiences?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, because what I found is that Shopify really does try to take a first principles approach to everything and not really care what anybody else does. Like, it's very, we always say this to people, right? Hey, don't care about what people think about you. And, but it's really hard to do in practice, right? If, Facebook, Google, Amazon, Twitter, Square, Stripe are doing something one way, then you look at it and say, those seem to be good engineering cultures. We should just copy it. And what's amazing about Shopify is, like, we mostly like try to learn as much as we can, like anybody, but very rarely are we just we're just looking at it going, now what do we think we should do at Shopify based on the things we've learned? And a lot of times it's completely different. Like, it's very strange to me, because like in a good way, that we will just try something different. I mean, well, here's one good example, right? A lot of the industry has moved towards like microservices, right? We have a giant monolith, right? The Ruby and Ruby on Rails kind of fell out of favor. We build our whole stack on it, and we're core contributors, right? I'm in mobile. I was building apps for many amazing companies, and we were always building native. Shopify's doing React Native, right? So like, we don't try to look and see what everybody else is doing. We try to look at other things, and we say, for instance, what's the technology curve? Where's it going? What are we going to do? How do we get engineering leverage? How do we make sure we build the right thing for our merchants? And that because it's so aligned with the mission, they end up being different questions and answers. And I think that it's refreshing. I mean, here, I'll give you another example. When we have our yearly kickoff, we have a thing called Shopify Summit. I've been to many of these in many companies, right? From Microsoft, at Trilogy, we had kickoffs, and they're very tactical, right? We talk about the products we're going to launch and what we did last year and like whatever. And at Shopify, we talk about like philosophy and like, how do we make sure we don't end up in a local maximum? Like, it's very like self-actualizing. Like, you think about your own life and you say, am I working on the most important thing I can be working on in my life? And it's refreshing, and it's very different.
That's awesome. Do you think that a lot of that was born out of the foundations of the company and where it came from?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely comes from, like, Toby's a very philosophical person, but it's also that he's not trying to do things to be popular, right? So when Ruby on Rails came out, right, he was a core contributor. It was like 04 or 06, like super early. And everybody said, there's no way you could ever build any scalable system on this thing. And his approach was not, well, Ruby's this thing and I'm making a bet. Instead, he's like, how do I make sure that it's not risky? I'm just going to fix Ruby or I'm going to fix Rails. Like, that's our approach, right? So when I wrote this blog post last year about using React Native for mobile, it wasn't that I made a risk analysis and said, okay, I don't think it's that risky, or maybe a few years from now, it might be the wrong decision. Instead, I look at it and say, how do I run head on to this risk? So what did I do? I hired core contributors. I run the working group. I'm with Facebook every month, right? I'm making the platform better. That's how I reduce the risk.
That's awesome. I love that way of looking at it, of like, it's not completely out of your hands, right? Like, you can reduce the risk by actually taking it more. It's almost the whole like, keep your friends
close.
Keep your enemies close.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm doing like a bear hug around React Native, right? So instead of like saying it's that thing over there that just happens to be a framework we use, I'm like, how do I affect the framework? How do I, I sponsored a company to like have 4 engineers work on open source.
That's awesome. Well, I want to the last thing I want to get into is one thing you mentioned around monolith versus microservices, because that's been big recently. Of like, we swung one way over like to microservices from like just monolith SOA to microservices, and now like coming back. And I read an article a couple of years ago that talked about how silos actually aren't bad, right? Silos themselves are meant for efficiency. Their efficiency of communication and work. It's that the silos need to be appropriately designed so that the majority of the work you do is within the silos, right? And that you keep the cross-silo communication, which has to happen to a minimum. And so, that also then speaks to organization design and repo design and things like that. And so how do you find that working in a monolith kind of allows you to have independent teams or not, like working in different areas. How do you get that right? Because that's one cross silo communication mechanism that you have to, contend with there.
You brought up a very good point, because we're a monolithic code base, but we were not a monolithic company. We used to have like product lines, and that was actually a cause for it was good for our evolution at that point. But very recently we made a pretty big org change to make the company more monolithic, like our code base. And that actually solved a lot of the problems. And the way we attack that is, like when you think of microservices, typically you have teams that try to own the end-to-end stack. And while there might be some efficiencies here or there, you really can own the end-to-end experience all the way from view to persistence.
Right.
And what we say instead is we say, you know what, because we're a monolith, we might have over 1,000 engineers in like one repo. We will actually instead have a team called developer acceleration to make everybody more effective. So instead what we do is we say, hey, we're going to build these shared services. We're going to try to go from N to one. You shouldn't have N ways to do something. You should have one way to do something. And where you put your code is just as important as the code you're writing. Mm-hmm. And so we want to make sure that we are leveling everybody up by all the things that we do. And that allows us to do something quite different, which is like in your mind, like the silo idea is to make sure that you're efficient in the things that you're doing. So we're efficient because we have people making the foundations efficient, people who are focused on the CI and CD, our test infrastructure, scalability, we have prod eng. But the other thing we do is we try to minimize code ownership. We try to say like, look, I know that team over there is the one responsible for writing most of the code, but you can go write code in there. They'll review your PR, but you don't you reduce the weighting in these types of environments by not saying like, oh, if it's not on your roadmap, people are like, I got to wait for that team. Instead, you're like, no, you can do it. They'll PR it and the PR review it, and then you can get out. So that's how we kind of get out of this like waiting game of like that team. And then it also gets us out of like having to build all that infrastructure ourselves.
So that's, not to get like super tactical in the weeds, but how do you handle things like merge conflicts, right? Because one of the things with everyone working in a monolith is you have lots of code, especially when you have 1,000 engineers that could touch the same thing, right? Which means that all of a sudden you get to potential merge conflicts. And because people are working in different areas, they might not have the context to appropriately resolve them.
Yeah, so we have a blog post about this, I'm pretty sure, how to merge like thousands of developers of code. There's a bunch of different things we do. One is we have quite an interesting way to merge, where we have like a probabilistic, like we actually have like a Monte Carlo algorithm that merges things in different orders and then runs automated tests to figure out what's the build that has the most likelihood of passing these tests. So we do things like that, and your merge might not get in which case you can try to remerge. So there's a bunch of these like techniques that we've learned over time that will allow us to like have a merge queue, figure out which merge should go in what order, deploy to production, run automated tests. And we're also big fans of like production. The only thing that's production is production. And so while we have automated tests and everything, we know some things are only available to be tested in the environment that they're going to be running on. And so we have amazing systems to like auto rollback if things are not looking well. And that allows engineers to be effective because they're deploying, and then they know when something's going in the merge queue to kind of watch to see the dashboards to see if anything wrong is happening. Test pass, it's good. Now you can go back to coding. So we have a bunch of techniques to do that, but it's because we have people working on infra that let us not have to focus on that end-to-end view that maybe a microservices team has to.
Yep. Which is interesting because you've taken the focus of an infra team, which might be on a service mesh and on observability and other things in a more microservices world, and put them on a different problem. Right?
Yes, exactly. And I mean, and then we do like, to be fair, we have monoliths, right? We have like 5 or 6, but the idea is that in most microservices environments that I've seen, you try to make it easy to have a service, and we try to make it super hard. Like it's possible, but we want to make it hard because we're like, in theory, you should try to figure out where your code can go in the existing infrastructure, and then only in extreme cases should you be building something new.
That's awesome. And so the last question I have around that is around ramp up time, right? Which is, one of the things about a monolith is that the amount of time it takes to go and understand and comprehend everything gets bigger and bigger, and you get to a point where one person can't understand all of it. So how do you get around that?
Yeah, for us, like it isn't true. It is probably not true that any one person can understand all of Shopify. Like there's enough going on. That's probably true of any company. You can't understand everything, but it's still modular, right? There's still modularization happening. It's just that we try to get rid of the network boundaries that you have to cross and orchestration. Like those things don't happen as much because you're still in that same code base. So yes, of course, it's still modular and you can figure out and learn about your area. You can also, like I mentioned, go and touch someone else's area via PR review. But there's, of course, like in any company, onboarding and things to help you understand the area you're onboarding into, and then you can learn more of the system over time.
Great. Well, thanks for the chat, Farhan. It's been great to catch up. Hopefully you got your cookies in while I had my beer here.
I'll finish it after this.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciated the conversation, and I will catch you all next time on Tesh on Tap.